Now for my introductions. Claude Steele, yay, was last year in 2014. It's been 12 years. It seems like only yesterday, Claude. He is a social psychologist and the Lucy Stern Professor in the Social Sciences, emeritus at Stanford. He's the author, as I'm sure all of you know, of Whistling Vivaldi, How Stereotypes Affect Us and What We Can Do, and now his new book, in your hot little hands, Churn, The Tension That Divides Us and How to Overcome It. He sits on a gazillion boards. He's just an amazing human being, heartfelt, deep, profound, sharp, smart, has really just set so many things in motion, and all of his academic progeny have come to the fan stage, from David Yaker and Jeffrey Cohen and Greg Walton and you name it. They've been here, and all of them owe gratitude to Claude Steele, who is the king. He is the guy, and he's going to be here in about 2 minutes. We love him. Joining him is someone who we very much admire and are so grateful for, Dr. Marcus Campbell, who is the superintendent here at ETHS. Since July of 2022, he was previously the assistant superintendent and principal here, where he was responsible for providing leadership. Now I'm going to read from the website. Providing leadership in the development of district strategy and organizational change, including effective instruction practices, impactful diversity and equity initiatives, and responsive programs and services. He has served on the FAN board for a decade, and he's our current board chair and my dear friend. So let's give a warm welcome to Professor Claude Steele and Dr. Marcus Campbell.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to ETHS, and thank you, Lonnie, for those fabulous introductions. And welcome back, Claude Steele. Can we give him another round of applause?
Great to be back. I feel like you guys ought to come down closer. We can have a little. Come on down.
Well, Dr. Steele, I have up there on the screen there that photo of you and I 12 years ago.
Oh my goodness!
You haven't changed much, but I have.
No, you. I think that's the same suit and shoes I had.
And so we'll jump right into the conversation.
Okay.
So you mentioned in the book that Churn, the tension, Jason, you can just follow along with the thing here. The tension that it can exist between races, ethnicities, genders, classes, generations, people of various sexual orientations, immigrant statuses, in schools, workplaces, civic organizations, boardrooms, athletic fields, doctors' offices, courtrooms, and elsewhere. What does this book, Churn, try to do?
It tries to bring into full view this kind of tension. I think it's a tension we experience a lot in our everyday lives. Everybody does. But I don't think we've had a word for it or a framework of thinking about it. And so in big part, that's probably the number one aspiration of the book, is to make us aware of that and what it is. If I can just jump right into trying to explain it, it's the attention we feel when we're in a situation, kind of an important situation in life, a classroom, a workplace, a traffic stop, and we worry about whether our identity, we're going to be devalued in some way based on our identity, based on stereotypes about that identity. So stereotype threat is a source of churn. And churn is just the psychological experience of being in that kind of situation where you don't know for sure if you're going to be devalued based on this. You don't know, but you could be, and this is an important situation, and so you become kind of vigilant and worried and aroused and a bit anxious, and if you feel this in a certain situation or a certain walk of life, even a certain career path, it can make that very difficult. It can be a really dark side of that kind of an experience. And I think it's something that can keep us apart, that can make it, when we think about being in maybe I'll go back one step. I think churn is something that happens in integrated, diverse situations. When I'm with my own kind, so to speak, if I can use that term, I feel pretty safe that I'm not going to be judged and treated in terms of bad images of that identity, because everybody has that identity. I'm an older guy. Every other Saturday I go for a walk with a number of other older people, and we end up in a coffee shop, and we feel pretty secure with each other. We're really slinging it around without too much a second thought. But if somebody younger were to join that group, we maybe have to worry a little bit. Part of our attention, part of our mental attention would have to be, well, if I say this, how will I be judged? Is that an old-fashioned, outdated idea? And would we be seen in terms of stereotypes that we're not technologically? So as soon as you diversify a setting, you kind of put yourself in a situation like that. And that is a fundamental feature of life in the United States. We're a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-classed world. And so when we come together in public places like our schools, in our workplaces, this tension can be there. And it can make us uncomfortable. We just feel it as kind of a, how do I say this? Can I say this here, or should I not say this here? Am I using the right vocabulary? Am I up to date? And the more important that situation, the more pressure that can put in a person's life.
Yeah, you mentioned that churn is the mental agitation and physical stress that we can experience in diverse settings, the threat of being judged and treated badly based on negative feelings or stereotypes about our identities. And you just referenced it there. Diversity is stressful.
I think can be inherently stressful. And again, if we're on the subway or something, and it's who cares? That isn't a situation that has much consequences for us. But again, if we are a student in a classroom, or a professor in a classroom, or a manager, or in a workplace, an employee in a workplace, or one of the two parties in the traffic stop, that's when that can be a pretty intense pressure.
That idea kind of turns on its head here, something we hear in our town in Evanston. Oh, we live here for the diversity, we love the diverse environment, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some responsibilities and also stresses that come along with being so diverse in so many ways. Not just racially diverse, but diverse in so many different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I want to promise everybody, this is the darkest part of the thinking.
It is. There's a lot of hope in this book.
There's some hope coming up here. You know, we're going in this direction where yes. I don't want us to just sink into our seats over this challenge. It's just an attempt to really be clear about this.
That's right.
I can remember, I've been a provost of several universities and responsible for how the culture, the academic culture in these institutions, and you notice right away that people are reluctant to come and talk about that. Mm-hmm. It's just, they want to kind of avoid that topic, or see it some other way, make it so it isn't really something we should give that much attention to. And there's a lot of defensiveness and churn.
Yeah.
About dealing with that aspect of life. And I suppose one of the insights I had after a while is that this isn't really about prejudice or bias. We tend to think these things are all about that, and that if we could wave a magic wand and eliminate prejudice and bias, then we'd have no problem. Everybody would come together very easily. But it struck me, that's not really true. And I can illustrate that with maybe the story I introduced the book with, if I take a minute to do that.
Of course.
You can imagine a parent-teacher conference in which the child and parents involved are African American, and the teacher is white. And I kind of describe the conversation between the parents as they get in their car to drive to this conference, and they're wondering, like, well, what kind of teacher is this? And is she a good teacher? Is she? They know full well the racial stereotypes about ability and aggressiveness and so on. And this is their opportunity to tell the teacher they don't want their son to be seen this way. And they want the school to really invest in the development of his abilities, and not to see his successes as the exception to the rule and his failures as the rule. They're worried about these things. They don't know that any of this will happen, but they don't know it won't happen. And so as they drive over to the meeting, they're full of churn. That's what churn is, this thinking and worrying and vigilance and agitation about the situation. And for her part, the teacher has an equally strong form of identity stereotype threat in that situation. She's, really dedicated to the welfare and development of her students. She's always been. She tries to be especially sensitive to the needs of minority students and the like. So she's all in. But how does she signal that to the teachers? To the parents in this situation? How do they know that? And so, and she, she also worries that if she has to say anything that's even slightly critical, that she could be seen in terms of the negative stereotypes relevant to her identity in that situation, that she's racist. And she would just hate that. That would be a horrific thing for her to experience. So here these two people are, these parties coming together to talk about the development of this young man in full churn. They're both worried about this, and that's a good example of what I mean by the tension that churn is. And they're all well-meaning in both parts, and interestingly, it would happen to them if they were prejudiced or if they were not prejudiced. It isn't something coming from their prejudice. It's coming from the role, the nature of these identities in our society and the stereotypes about those identities, the history of our country, the way in which our country is organized around identities, and it's coming from all that. And I think we often confuse that kind of tension, this churn, with tension that comes out of and reflects prejudices and biases and so on, which I think are very important. As a social psychologist, I'm not diminishing the importance of those things in human affairs. They're powerful, but I'm trying to be clear about this other form of tension. And I'm going to, the hopeful part of it is that I think in many ways this tension is easier to solve and treat and get past than prejudice is able to get past. And I think it can empower us in an era when we need some empowerment with regard to the complexity and multiness of our society.
Yeah, that kind of goes into what I was thinking. I worry about folks that don't churn.
Yeah.
Folks who are not concerned about diversity at all, and in this environment, how can you speak to that a little bit? This idea that I'm not churning because of whatever beliefs that they hold and they carry with these identities of power. And they're just like, no, I'm not really interested or really care about whatever perception. I'm not worried about being perceived as a racist. Speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I thought about that. And what I think is everybody's going to experience churn, even if I'm a diehard racist, and I really don't mind being seen that way, even if I'm. When I'm in a real life setting, in a school or in a workplace, and a lot of the book points to it's grounded in the real settings of our lives, not in the abstract, general, I don't know what that is, atmosphere of life in the United States. I'm talking about real life situations, and in those situations, I think that kind of person too would be they know the consequences of being seen as racist. So they may be racist, but if they also know that if they're seen that way, it can interfere with their welfare and progress and image and so on. So very few people are impervious in that way to the threat that tied to their identity in a situation like that.
Yeah, we're going to get to the hope and we talk about trust in just a little bit, but what do you think the long-term physiological and psychological impact is of spending a lifelong of churning based on a marginalized identity for someone who's just going through life, churning, and all of the intersections in life of identity that they carry. Like, what are the long-term physiological and psychological impacts of that?
Yeah, I think, because probably both of us have had lives like this, or having lives like that. There are consequences, blood pressure, and there's so much research now that's accumulated over the years looking at these identity threats, these stereotype threats, in very low-stakes laboratory situations, and even in those situations, you see, incredible reactivity, blood pressure, skin conductance, emotional reactions, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that we use to think and reason and so forth, gets suppressed. The part of the brain, the amygdala, which is sensitive to threat and sort of is aroused when we feel like we're under threat, is highly activated, So going through that on a continuing basis is a formidable burden to bear. Yeah. And if you commit your life to a path where for you have to experience that kind of threat on an ongoing basis, it can be very difficult. Most people won't stay on that path. A lot of the research done on this has looked at academics, African Americans in academic lives, women in STEM fields and mathematical fields, white males in basketball.
White man can't jump. Right?
Yeah, well, just think about that. You love basketball, you want to play, but at every turn you're meeting a world in this society, in the United States, where you're probably seen through the lens of negative stereotypes about your potential. Right. And will people invest in it to the same degree? And how will your successes may be seen as kind of, again, exceptions to the rule.
That's right.
And the farther up you go, the more intense that's going to be. And so at a certain point, you may say, there must be an easier way for another walk of life for me.
Right. Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned, because what you're saying is even people who hold identities of power do churn, just depends on the context.
It depends on the context.
Yeah.
For example, I do have the pet theory that many of the most impressive white basketball players are from Eastern Europe, or from Europe in general, where they grew up and learned the game in an environment where those stereotypes weren't there. But in the United States, so there are these powerful cumulative effects of identity threat that I don't think we appreciate. What's my college major going to be? I remember having a young woman, white, really brilliant at math at Stanford, and she was in my psychology class, and I said we were talking about her background in math, which was so impressive, and she said, yeah, but I don't feel like I belong here. I go by the math classes, and there's not a lot of people in there like me. So she's got the interest, she's got the capacity, she's got the motivation, but she's reading the world she would have to go into if she were going to pursue that as a world in which she would sort of constantly be under the pressure of, she wouldn't know for sure ever. She wouldn't know if that particular comment was based on her identity and the stereotypes about it. She wouldn't know, but she'd be constantly in churn. So she feels lost, and she's looking for something else to do. So I think that it has that kind of effect. What your major is, what your career path is going to be, what neighborhood you're going to live in, what friendship networks you're going to pursue, how much time you're going to spend here versus there. We do an inherent calculation of how much threat or possibility of devaluation we're going to face based on our identities.
Yeah. So you talk about trust as an antidote to churn. Can you just expand upon that? Just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Now we're getting to the happier part.
Turn the page.
As daunting as the situation I've tried to describe is, there is an antidote, and that is trust. And I think a lot of us experience that in our lives. I think both of us probably have, or we wouldn't be where we are. That somebody trusted us. Trust is there's often the phrase I've heard many times in my life that prejudices don't survive proximity very well. And I think when we get close to people and we have a chance to develop a sense of trust, that churn goes away. Because churn is about mistrust. I can't quite trust the situation. I can't quite trust how I'm going to be seen here. So I have to be worried about how I'm going to present myself and what's going to happen and do I have the right appreciation of what's going on? And you have all those worries that come from being in a situation that you can't quite trust whether your image is safe or not. But if you have evidence that it is safe, and you can believe that evidence, you can accept it, then the churn goes away, because that's what it's all about in the first place. So that's where this argument takes a more optimistic turn, is in that direction. The book is a lot about, well, how do you build that trust, and how do you build it across identity differences and divides?
Yeah, and you mentioned in the book that you don't really build trust by being colorblind or identity blind.
No, I wish you would. I wish it would work. I'm old enough to remember when colorblindness was a very progressive idea in the 60s. That's how we're going to do it. That's when we adopted the sort of set of legislation that really got rid of the apartheid world we'd been living in up to that time. Civil Rights Acts, Fair Housing Acts, Immigration Acts, whole package of things in the 60s. I think we underappreciate what happened in the 60s in terms of a kind of a legislative revolution that we will have an integrated society. It was quite a moment in our history, really. And so what we've experienced in the wake of all that, I think of as sort of an experiment. Well, how do you actually make it happen? How do you actually allow this to happen? And I think we've tried a whole, package of policies that have gotten a lot of attention: affirmative action, busing, a whole variety of things to try to accomplish that. And here we are in this period where resistance to most of those things is in ascendance, and coming from the highest authorities in the land, and kind of devastating, as we were talking earlier, devastating a lot of the infrastructure that was enabling us to accomplish those things. So we're at a moment where what will we do? The problem doesn't go away. We still need a system that does effectively expand opportunity in this society, and so that it doesn't, so that we can get behind us this past that we've had. But that's how I characterize where I think we are at this point, where this book enters the argument.
Yeah, you say that this book proposes a different strategy. Thank you, Jason, for that we got the quotes behind you on the screen.
I see.
A focus on building trust that real-life settings can meet the needs of people of all identities. And then there's another part of the book where you say this. You said, I said this to a friend who had perhaps unwisely asked me what I was writing a book about. And growing a bit impatient with my response, he asked the question, what is the advantage of focusing on trust building rather than what we more typically focus on, changing people's prejudicial beliefs? Wouldn't eradicating prejudice be a more important thing to do?
It would be a marvelous thing to do if we could do it.
If we could do it.
I mean, psychology, most sciences have had their big disappointments, and that's been one for. So it's hard to do it. We're so our biases are so reflexive, and they're picked up so incidentally from just existing in a world that it's hard. You can still hand out an essay in almost any American school, and you put a girl's name on it, it gets a lower grade than if you put a boy's name on it. or a black kid's name on it, or you can still get these. Think about traffic stops and the quick situation in which those stereotypes have their opportunity to affect our behavior and shape it. So getting rid of prejudice, we can manage it. Like my colleague Jennifer Eberhardt has geniusly figured out and tested in the Oakland Police Department that if you put a lot of bureaucracy between the officer and the driver, you make the officer do all these check forms on a computer, you slow down the situation. You put friction in it. Then you give the officer a chance not to be so much in the grip of those stereotypes and images which they have very little awareness of at the time. And it's a highly charged situation. Does he have a gun? No. Does he have a gun? It's such a loaded situation. So that's a good example of how we're learning how to deal with prejudices. But one other way, I think, that fits the argument and illustrates the argument of the book to maybe eliminate prejudices, and I bet a lot of you in this audience have had this experience, is that once you get to know people and trust them, you know, the ideas and stereotypes you have about their identities go out the window. They just don't, you know, that's my friend. I don't even think about that with regard to my friend. We relate in it. So that to me would mean you've had some opportunity to build up a trusting relationship with that person. And so that route to eliminating prejudice, I think, has been underappreciated. And it argues that maybe the primary focus of our efforts should be more in these settings that are so important in our lives. The primary focus should be building that trust and that connection. And that once that starts to be a part of the fabric of a setting, the real fabric, it's a high morale place. I can think of a basketball team. It's on my mind these days. If that's one of what a good coach, that's the art of being a good coach, is building a trust that we can trust each other, right? Even though there are differences in salaries and differences in playing times and differences in races and differences in all kinds of things could enter in and cause churn. And churn is going to distract from playing basketball. Yeah. And so you have to kind of, that's an example of why it may be why it may be so important to focus on building trust. And the hope I would have is that maybe this is an integration or a diversity 2.0, that this can be another focus for us. Yeah. And I think it's something everybody can do. You know, I don't want to interrupt you.
No. No, you mentioned toward the end of the book, you say this is not a substitute for prejudice or diversity workshops. This is just something that we need to be considering as we do those things.
Yeah. That's where I was going with it. Because trust building is something for all kinds of reasons, I think, is critical. It is a game that is played on the ground. That's the term I use for it at the end of the book, that it's who shows up, it's who listens and listens again, that is really tries to see not just how the other person's emotions or how they're reacting to things. What you want to see is the circumstances of life that they're contending with. Mm-hmm. What are they dealing with? Mm-hmm. That gives you a genuine, more complete empathy of things. And often empathy is meant, well, I should pay attention to the fact that this person is suffering now, or that this person is not suffering anymore, or I should be reading their emotions. But I'm arguing that trust comes from the fact that I know you recognize, at least to some degree, the circumstances that I'm dealing with in my life, and that you have a beneficence toward them, that you want to, as is reasonable, you want to help me deal with them. If somebody does that, I trust them, and I don't really care whether their identity is the same as mine or not. I trust them. They're on my side. We can build something together. We can get past that tension, so to speak.
Yeah, you talk about being wise, Professor Steele,
yeah,
in the book. Like, what does it mean to be wise? It's old school slang there, but I know what you
Yeah.
were doing in the book. But what does
What
does that mean?
Well, Irving Goffman, a very famous sociologist, did an ethnography of gay life in San Francisco, my city, in the 50s. And he found that the gay men in that community had a word for the straight people who they knew saw their full humanity, understood that despite the heavy stigma that they were dealing with in that, especially in that time, that these people, these wise people, knew that they were full human beings and treated them that way. African Americans have a ton of phrases like that, like, he's cool, man, he's cool. Don't worry about him, man, he's cool. Don't worry about him, man, he's cool. That's got the whole formulation in there. The worry, don't churn, man, don't churn, he's cool. He does see he sees that you're a human, and that you've got all the feelings and potentials of a human. And when we're in a hurry, that's not always clear. And again, when we have we have a society with these historically defined different identities that have these historically challenged and ongoing challenging relationships to each other, what we may be missing most of all is the notion that we need to develop a trust for each other. That it's hard to, like the school teacher and the parents, they didn't say anything to each other. They just know, as members of this society, that can I trust that I'm going to be safe in this conversation, or is something going to happen here that it would be very uncomfortable, and maybe I could avoid this conversation. Maybe I could avoid this conversation. For example, would the teacher avoid giving the young student involved good, critical, important feedback that would be important to his development? Would she avoid that because she's prejudiced against the student and his family, or because of churn? She's just worried about what would happen if she gives that feedback. That kind of illustrates the two things that are at play. It's probably not prejudice. It's probably not that. It's probably the fact that if she says it, this whole judgment can come down on her. And she can't trust in that situation that judgment won't come down on her. So that's the dilemma that we're in as Americans, and I think this is true in many societies, but let's talk about our own for now. I think that's the tension we're in. We can't be sure that we're going to say the right thing, do the right thing, and come out, so we avoid.
Yeah. I love that you say we kind of miss that when we don't slow down. But I'm going to put wiseness up. I have a bit of a definition of wiseness that you highlight in the book, and I want to stay with this parent-teacher conference because we have thousands of them here. They said wiseness then is being able to see full humanity, potential, and difference, and people on the other side of an identity or divide, or on the downside, or a bad group stereotype or reputation, and then acting accordingly. And so, with that parent-teacher conference, you highlighted in the book explicitly, what does it mean for that teacher to be wise as they approach that white female teacher approaches the conversation, the conferences? What does it mean for that family, that mom and that dad, or that family, however family looks, to be wise as they approach the teacher? You outline a lot of things that could happen to avoid, as they're both dealing with stereotype threat in their turn. So what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, first, if they're not wise, you can see that the conversation between them could go awry.
Yes.
In a whole variety of ways. She could say something about, and then they would resist what she said about it, and then she would resist what they said about her, and there could be a lot of defensiveness that would cloud the constructiveness of that meeting. Both parties might have wanted to have, but without that trust resolve, I do think, just stepping back, what is wiseness? I do think it's something that we know when we experience it, but it's hard to articulate. And I'm a psychologist, so it is my job to try to.
It's humanizing, in a lot of ways.
It's humanizing, and that we know that when we see somebody, we know we kind of can pick that up, whether they see us. Do they see us? That's often. I was listening to a podcast today with Michelle Obama, and she was talking about when she would go. She went to the hospital where a lot of the veterans were recovering from war injuries, and she realized that she's supposed to be there for 45 minutes. She was there for 5 hours, because what she really needed to do was to give them a sense that she saw them, that she understood what they had contended with, and that you just can't just breeze through. So I do think that's at the heart of wiseness, and that when somebody treats you like that, it's very disarming. You know it, and it changes your emotion in this situation. You are wiser, you are calmer. The churn starts to recede a little bit. You can begin to relate to the people in the sort of straightforward way that you'd like to be able to relate to them. And I again want to remind us in this discussion, this is something that if I'm just in that group of old guys on Saturday morning, I don't have to maybe worry about this so much, because we're all old guys and we all went through the same, there's so much similarity there that there's an easy trust. But when you bring people into public settings, important settings that are diverse, made up of these identities that have considerable histories between them, that trust is something that has to be built. And that may be a more promising focus for how to pursue and develop diversity, the kind of getting us to the sort of post-racial or whatever idealized world kind of society that we'd like to get. Doing that, approaching it that way. I'll give you an example of an experiment. Maybe.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, you completed a study where the professor gave critical feedback to a black student to have these values feedback trusted. That's the study you're talking about?
Yeah. I think you've had him here as a speaker, but he did this. I was his advisor, and so he did this as his dissertation. It was all his idea, I have to point out. But nonetheless, so the question was, how do you give critical feedback to how does a white professor, give critical feedback
to a black student
and have it be trusted? And so we had white and black students at Stanford come in, write an essay about their favorite teacher, told them if it was good, we might publish it in a magazine on teaching that we were starting on campus, so they should really put their best foot forward. And then they came back 2 days later and they got the feedback, and the big measure was how much did they trust it, and what we varied was how we gave the feedback. And what's interesting, expected, but a little unsettling, is that when we gave the feedback straightforwardly, here's the feedback on your essay, or when we said something really nice about the person before we gave them the feedback, you bring a lot of good energy to my class, here's the feedback. The white students trusted it. They're not under a stereotype about their abilities in that situation. If anything, at Stanford, they think they're really smart. So they're not worried about that. But the black students, for them, that is a fundamentally ambiguous situation. They don't know whether the feedback is coming from their essay that they wrote or whether it's coming from the feedback giver's opinions of their group's abilities. They don't know. And so not knowing, they don't trust it. And not trusting it, they don't benefit from it. And that's something that doesn't just happen once and never happens again. That's a fundamental part of their education in a diverse world. So that's how primal this effect can be. But there is the bright way of giving the feedback. The good news, you want me to get to that.
No, take your time, Professor Steele. Take your time.
No, you should give me all the signals you need to give me, man. But that feedback giver just said, look, we're using high standards in evaluating these essays, and I read your essay, and I think you can meet those standards. Here's the feedback. Mm-hmm. Well, when it was said that way, the black students trusted the feedback more than any other group of students in the study, and 3 times more of them took the essay home to use the feedback to improve the essay. So all along, they wanted to trust that situation, but they had churn. And it didn't have churn because they were weak or whatever, or too political or too left. They just had churn because any human being in that situation would have churn. It's fundamentally confusing as to what the feedback means in this society for them about this topic. And so they churned and couldn't trust. But as soon as they had a slightest signal that he doesn't see me through the lens of that stereotype. If he did, he wouldn't say he was using high standards. And certainly he wouldn't say that he thinks I can meet those standards. So those 2 comments take the time to tell the student that I see you and I believe in you. I'm going to grant you that. I'm not going to sit back and say, you got to prove yourself to me and all that stuff. That might work if you were just white teacher, white students. Maybe black teacher, black students. But across the identity divide, there's too much churn in there for that to work. There has to be a moment where the teacher builds a little trust and understands that that's what is essential in order for that student to be able to trust that feedback in that situation. So that's kind of one of the...
So a couple of things I want to get you. Thank you for sharing that. A couple of things I want to get to. So you also mentioned that giving people the opportunity to tell you about their values, their needs, and their own agendas amounted to wiseness and was a usable strategy. So how do you trust when let's say you're sharing ideas and you're trying to build trust? How do you trust when you find values and beliefs of someone else just utterly repulsive? Especially when those beliefs put your own identity or the identity of your loved ones at risk.
Ooh, man. Has anybody here got a good answer to that? That's tough, man. I can say I thought a lot about it. And you can tell one of the chapters in the book, I'm so concerned about that.
You write it. You put the next one up there because you do say, you right there, like, how can I trust people from groups who have done things to my group, people who benefit from advantages won by those bad things, people who often justify those advantages with dehumanizing stereotypes of my group, who often see my group's progress not as a good thing. Yeah. So you acknowledge it, Yes. How do we...
Yes.
How do we do that?
Well, in that same chapter, I argue that in many situations, let's say the classroom or the workplace or the traffic stop, that the person who's in the authority seat has to go first with this trust building stuff. You can't expect somebody to ignore that. You just can't, because they won't be able to, and no rational person would be able to, unless they've they've started to have a few gears slipping, and they're going to understand that and be understandably vigilant in a diverse, integrated situation. You just can't ignore that. So I think in many of the settings that are important to us in our society, the authority figure has to move forth first with this. Yeah. Still, though. What would you tell the black student at Stanford to relax, trust the situation? How would you help them do that? That question still exists, and that's an interesting. It's an interesting question.
Well, you talk about a way that this was done, and you talk about President Obama and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and saying that Ta-Nehisi, Obama being a black man running for president, had to trust white people.
Yeah.
And you explore this Ta-Nehisi's discussion of this in the book, which I think is like, oh, this is a good example of this. A black man who, by his identity, could feel under threat, having to trust white people to become president of the United States.
Yeah.
And you explore that in the book. Maybe talk a little bit about that in a way that it maybe can be done.
Yeah, because I want to also, I'll talk about that, but I also want to come back to, well, what do you tell my son, your son? How do you deal with the situation where maybe the authority isn't so hip? And how do you? I'll come back to that question. Because that's the hardest one. So the point about Obama kind of also makes this argument that it's an extremely arresting argument by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who interviewed him. And how'd you get to be the president with a name like that? Who's Barack Hussein? And he finds that Obama, having been raised in Hawaii, a kind of not a relatively racially stratified society by a white family and so on, Barack says that, unlike Michelle, I didn't worry so much that I was going to be treated unfairly. I basically said I didn't have a lot of churn growing up under the circumstances that I had. And so Coates says, I think, in a very perceptive way, well, look, what Barack could do is something that anybody who is going to be elected president has to do, but that most African Americans would never be prepared to do, which is to say to white people, I trust you. I trust you. I will be responsive to your needs. I'm going to take the time to figure out what your needs are, and I can do that. And his very particular background, according to Coates and several of Barack's friends, one friend says, well, Barack was, he was raised in a white household, and you can't be raised in a household by whites and believe that they don't love you. You can't do that. So he loved them, and they loved him, and he had that as an experiment. No churn. He knew it was possible. He could emotionally bridge that identity divide, and make that kind of statement to the nation that many African Americans, not having that kind of an experience, would be unable to make that kind of statement. And the friend says, if it wasn't like that, then he would be just like Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton. He would be in a different mode in this situation. But because he's had this background, he's relaxed. He feels like maybe in some instances it's delusional, but he nonetheless. Yeah, but he feels that way, so he can operate and function in a different way. I just thought it was so interesting.
Very interesting.
It's one of the best analyses I've heard of what it is, of why a person with that kind of an identity could be so effective politically in a land as with our history.
Yeah. So back to the student of color, black kid, talking to the white professor who that student might feel some degree of churn, and maybe he has had an experience being dehumanized by that professor. What could and should, my son is here, he's in college, but what could, God forbid that happened to him, but it could. What's the advice? How do students of color or anybody who has an identity under threat navigate a situation and trying to build trust where they might be also under threat?
Yeah. How do they build the trust?
Exactly. Because it's on the person,
Yeah.
It should be on the leader, but it
should be on the leader.
In this case, it's not. How does the person on the other side build trust?
Yeah. So here's my thinking on that. See if you buy it.
We'll see.
It's going to sound strange because, but I think you have to learn to structure a situation. I'm thinking about coming into college or coming into high school, or one of the things that some of the research at the end of toward the end of the book shows how important it is for these situations to be structured, because ambiguity in these important settings, work settings, school settings, ambiguity forces the person who's in churn, and it forces churn on them. I think of myself going to college, and from Chicago to a little liberal arts college in Ohio. 8 black students in this whole college.
You didn't have a real strong first semester there either, did you?
Yeah, and I am floundering in this place. I couldn't understand what was wrong with me, and in that. The situation was ambiguous. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to cope with the situation. And so that ambiguity made me consider whether or not my problem was racial. Force that. You can't ignore that. Mm-hmm. Not in the United States. Maybe these people just don't like me. They're never going to let me. And I had, there were 8 of us students. I had a black roommate. I was given a black roommate. His father, after 6 months, came to college, picked him up in a Cadillac, and said, we're leaving this school. They're never going to let you be a doctor here. Never going to let you. Put him in a historically black college. And he became a great doctor, a pediatric surgeon of national note. And it was true. That school couldn't see him in that way. I mean, there was a lot of truth to it. Yeah. You
talk about seeing and supporting at the end of the book, but go ahead, keep going.
Yeah. But the question now is, well, I was left behind. What do I do? and I think what saved me, I had a roommate who was a really good student, just by chance in my sophomore year, and I decided that, and my father back here in Chicago saw my grades, and he was like, well, you got to do this college thing, man. Maybe it's not your thing. I've got you hooked up with Frank Toller. You're going to be he's an electrician. You're going to be his apprentice. We're going to start in February. This was at Christmas. I came home for Christmas my sophomore year, and we're done with that, man. And that woke me up. So I begged him to let me go back to college, and he said he wouldn't take me. And so I hitchhiked back to college just south of Cleveland from here. And I had this roommate, and he was a good student, and I just did everything. I said, I'm going to do everything you do, man. I'm going to copy you in detail. First, I'm going to go to class.
Lesson number 1.
Yeah, number 1. I'm going to try to read the book before I go to class. I'm going to try to, and you rewrite your notes after class. And okay, I'll do that, man. And he showed me how to read the chapter. He said, you're going through it with yellow marker, marking everything yellow, man. And why don't you just, don't do that. Just skim the chapter, get the outline, skim it again. Now you got the outline and the facts just attached to the outline very easily. Wow, that was one of the more transformative pieces of advice I ever got in my life. I still do that. But with this accumulation of things, I started getting all A's.
And you couldn't do that without trust.
And I couldn't do that without trust. I mean, and then because I started doing that and started succeeding in the situation, I started to not worry that my race was the issue so much, because I was succeeding in the issue. It sort of defeated that worry that my identity was the source of my problems in this American situation. It was a rational consideration. As long as I was failing and having trouble, that was a rational consideration that kept me in churn. But as I started to do better, because the situation was structured and I knew how to cope with it, that became less relevant. And I really realized I could succeed in this situation.
And look at you now, right?
So to speak.
And just as we wrap up, you talk about teachers being wise, schools and work settings being wise, institutions having wiseness and paradigms being wise. And what you're really suggesting is schools offering supports and opportunities for kids to be seen and to be supported, either at the secondary level, at the college level. But these, and you talk about even like these cues that they can be, put together in places. And so, and in my education mind, I think that's being culturally responsive in some ways, but it's also humanizing institutions. How can institutions humanize their students? How do workplaces humanize their employees, et cetera, et cetera? So you talk about that a little bit at the end of the book, which is offer a solution, and it reduces churn in schools and the workplace when kids can be seen and supported.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the second, maybe the last 2/3 of the book are kind of a program for how to do this at the level, between individuals. How do I convey that and build through wiseness? I give examples of Miles Davis and Gil Evans and all kinds of relationships, how you do it at the level of individuals. We have an experiment, because I think it's useful, practical advice that illustrates this. We set up, I did this with Phil Goff, a student at the time, and we brought in white males, and they were going to have a conversation with 2 other students, and they found out that the 2 other students were either 2 white guys or 2 black guys, and they were going to either have the conversation about something anybody can talk to anybody about, like love and relationships, or it was going to be a heavy conversation about racial profiling. And then the experimenter says, I'm going to go down the hall and get your 2 conversation partners and bring them back, and while I'm gone, would you just arrange these three chairs here for the conversation? And what we're after, you can imagine, is given the conversation they expect to have, how close do they seat themselves to the conversation partners? And sure enough, when they're going to talk to 2 white guys about anything or 2 black guys about love and relationships, they put the 3 chairs very close together. But when they're going to talk to 2 black guys about racial profiling, they distance themselves. And what they're worried about, we have measures on this too, is that they're going to make a mistake and be seen as racist. So the question is, how do you get them to, for that conversation, move their chairs close together, be comfortable in that situation? We tried, in another experiment, we tried a number of things for probably a year and a half, a lot of which came from diversity literature, some of which I'd advocated, and it didn't work. They kept that distance. But the thing that did work was advice which just said, look, nobody knows how to have these conversations. They can be difficult in our society. Just relax and treat this as an opportunity to learn about somebody else's experience and what their life is like. And when you're in doubt, ask questions. Don't try to prove you're not prejudiced and have never ever been prejudiced. Don't go that's a red flag. Just treat it as an opportunity to actually see the experience, the life context of another person, and just ask a few questions. With that instruction, they moved their chairs close together and had that difficult. So I think at the level of individuals, that's a good illustration of wiseness, where you see and you enjoy. Once you do that and you build trust across an identity divide like that, the relationship becomes fun. It becomes very enriching. And we are always talking rhetorically about the value of diversity. But that's how its value is reaped, is when you feel like comfortable. And then, man, you celebrate other people's experience and the experience of their groups. And you learn from that. You enjoy that. This is a bounty we have in the United States. I was a Francophile. You go to Paris, you love the food, it's magnificent. After about 10 days, you say, yeah, but where's the Mexican food? They only eat this food? I mean, we have a richness here that is an amazing wealth, an amazing source of wealth in this society. That's at the individual level. The book also tries to deal, well, how does a whole institution deal with this? And I think one of the things there is that I looked high and low for places where, in the academic world, my world, where women and minorities were doing as well as men. And there's very few places like that. At elite graduate schools like at Berkeley or in higher education in general. But there were two that I found. And what both of them shared, even though they're very different institutions, Berkeley's Chemistry College, Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, big 55,000 student campus, both of them understood that the institution needs to come to the students and find out exactly what the problems are, what they're frustrated by, and then set up programmatically to address those things, to give them a sense of that the institution sees who they are, and pretty soon those students, seeing that the institution is going that far, they have an orientation program before school begins, and they just tell them. They give them financial literacy training. They give them, here's what this university can do for you. They lay out these things. These are things that students from low-income backgrounds just don't have. So they give them the know-how that my roommate gave me. And they structure the place so you kind of know where you are, and there's not a lot of ambiguity. They take some of the ambiguity out of the situation, and lo and behold, they start to produce outcomes that almost no other institutions in higher education produce, at a very high level. So I think I especially like that end of the book, because it shows that the principle can have very broad implications and applications to situations that we think of as very complicated, but even schools as big as this one, these kind of things can really make a difference, and you start to get rid of performance gaps, and you start to open up people's lives for them.
Yeah. Well, Professor Steele, thank you for being here. Thank you for all of what you have contributed to the Academy and to our lives and your brilliance. It has been an honor to be on stage with you tonight. And once again, thank you for your conversation in Evanston. So,
thank you, man. Thanks. Much appreciated. Those kind words.